World War I, the Great War. It all began in 1914, when Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary was assassinated in Sarajevo. What should have been a regional crisis spiraled into a global war, as tangled alliances pulled in the world's great powers. On one side, the Allies, Britain, France, Russia, later joined by Italy and the United States. On the other, the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. The fighting was brutal. Trench warfare, machine guns, poison gas. A stalemate that turned Europe's fields into graveyards. By the war's end in 1918, over 20 million people were dead and empires had crumbled. The Treaty of Versailles ended the war but left Germany humiliated, planting the seeds for an even deadlier conflict just 2 decades later. The Russian Civil War. By 1917, Russia was collapsing under World War I. Millions were dead, food was scarce, and the Tsar's rule finally crumbled. Out of the chaos, the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, seized power in the October Revolution. But Russia wasn't united behind them. Almost overnight, the country split in two. The Reds, the Bolsheviks fighting to establish communist rule, and the Whites, a messy alliance of monarchists, liberals, and foreign powers, including Britain, France, Japan, and the United States, all desperate to crush communism before it spread. What followed was one of the most brutal civil wars in modern history. Entire cities starved, villages were burned, and terror reigned on both sides. The Red Terror saw mass executions, while famine and disease claimed millions more lives than the bullets did. By 1923, the Bolsheviks emerged victorious. The cost? Somewhere between 7 to 12 million dead. From the ashes of the Russian Empire rose the Soviet Union, a state that would dominate the 20th century and set the stage for the Cold War to come. The Second Sino-Japanese War. In 1937, Japan launched a full-scale invasion of China, sparking what would become one of the deadliest wars in history. It began with the Marco Polo Bridge incident and quickly spiraled into a brutal campaign of conquest. Japan's forces swept through China's cities with devastating speed, committing atrocities that shocked the world. The most infamous, the rape of Nanking, saw hundreds of thousands of civilians massacred and tens of thousands of women assaulted in just weeks. China, divided between Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists and Mao Zedong's communists, was forced into a fragile united front against the invaders. Despite bitter infighting, they resisted fiercely, dragging Japan into a long, grinding war of attrition. The conflict became deeply tied to World War II. After Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941, the war in China merged into the global struggle. By 1945, with Japan's surrender, China emerged victorious but shattered. The human cost was staggering. Up to 20 million Chinese dead, most of them civilians. The war left scars of destruction, mistrust, and trauma that still shape East Asia today. World War II. In 1939, the world was plunged into the deadliest conflict in human history. It began when Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler invaded Poland. Britain and France declared war, and soon nearly every great power on earth was drawn into the fight. On one side were the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, bent on conquest and domination. On the other, the Allies, Britain, the Soviet Union, China, and eventually the United States, struggling for survival. The war spanned continents. German tanks blitzed through Europe, Japan swept across Asia and the Pacific, and Britain endured relentless bombing. The Eastern Front became a nightmare of unimaginable scale, with battles like Stalingrad leaving millions dead. But the darkest chapter was the Holocaust, where 6 million Jews and millions of others were systematically murdered in death camps. The tide turned in 1944 with the D-Day landings, and by 1945, Allied forces closed in on Berlin. In the Pacific, the U.S. dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, forcing Japan's surrender. By the war's end, an estimated 70 to 85 million people were dead, soldiers and civilians alike. Empires crumbled, the United Nations was born, and the stage was set for the Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. The Korean War. In June 1950, the Cold War turned hot. Backed by the Soviet Union and China, North Korea invaded the South, aiming to unite the peninsula under communism. Within weeks, South Korean forces were nearly pushed into the sea. But the United States and United Nations intervened. A daring counterattack at Incheon, led by General Douglas MacArthur, turned the tide, driving the North Koreans all the way back to the Chinese border. That's when China entered the war, sending hundreds of thousands of soldiers flooding across the Yalu River. The fighting seesawed back and forth, brutal battles in freezing mountains and muddy hills, until the front stabilized near the 38th parallel. After 3 years of savage stalemate, an armistice was signed in 1953. The result? Korea remained divided. North and South, a split that still defines global politics today. The human cost was staggering. Around 3 million dead, most of them civilians, with cities flattened and families permanently separated. And the Korean War became known as the Forgotten War in the West. But for Koreans, its scars have never faded. The Nigerian Civil War. In 1907, Nigeria, newly independent and already unstable, tore itself apart. The southeastern region, home to the Igbo people, declared independence as the Republic of Biafra after ethnic tensions and massacres left thousands dead. The Nigerian government refused to let the oil-rich region break away, and war erupted. At first, Biafra fought fiercely, using guerrilla tactics to hold back Nigeria's larger army. But as the war dragged on, Nigeria tightened its blockade. What followed was one of the worst humanitarian disasters of the 20th century. Starvation became a weapon of war. Images of emaciated Biafran children shocked the world and spurred the rise of international aid organizations like Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders. By 1970, Biafra surrendered. The human cost was staggering, 1 to 3 million dead, the vast majority from famine rather than bullets. The war left scars that still shape Nigeria's politics and ethnic tensions today, a brutal reminder of how civil wars devastate nations from within. The Vietnam War. The Vietnam War began as a struggle for independence. After defeating the French in 1954, Vietnam was split. Communist North Vietnam, led by Ho Chi Minh, and anti-communist South Vietnam, backed by the United States. At first, it was guerrilla warfare, with the Viet Cong ambushing South Vietnamese and U.S. forces. But soon, it escalated into a full-scale war. The U.S. poured in hundreds of thousands of troops, unleashing overwhelming firepower, napalm, Agent Orange, and relentless bombing campaigns. Yet the jungle swallowed armies whole. The Viet Cong fought a war of patience, blending into villages, striking suddenly, then vanishing. The infamous Tet Offensive of 1968 shocked America, proving the war was far from over. Back home, protests erupted. The war dragged on, costing billions of dollars and thousands of lives, with no clear victory in sight. By 1973, U.S. troops withdrew. 2 years later, North Vietnamese forces captured Saigon, uniting the country under communism. The cost was devastating, 2 to 3 million Vietnamese dead, alongside 58,000 Americans. Vietnam was left shattered, and the U.S. was scarred by its most divisive war of the 20th century. The Yom Kippur War. On October 6, 1973, the holiest day in Judaism, Yom Kippur, Egypt, and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel. Their goal to reclaim lands lost in the Six-Day War of 1967, including the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights. At first, Israel was caught completely off guard. Egyptian forces stormed across the Suez Canal, smashing through Israel's defenses, while Syrian tanks surged onto the Golan Heights. For days, it looked as if Israel might collapse. But Israel fought back fiercely. With massive U.S. support and weapons and supplies, they turned the tide. Israeli counterattacks pushed deep into Syrian territory and even crossed the Suez Canal into Egypt. The war ended after just 3 weeks with a UN-brokered ceasefire. But the world was shaken. The fighting killed over 2,000 Israelis and more than 8,000 Arab soldiers. And it sparked the 1960 oil crisis as Arab states cut oil exports, sending shockwaves through the global economy. Though militarily a stalemate, the war reshaped the Middle East, leading to future peace talks between Egypt and Israel and cementing U.S. and Soviet rivalry in the region. The Iran-Iraq War. In 1980, Middle Eastern rivals Iran and Iraq plunged into one of the longest and bloodiest wars of the 20th century. Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein, fearing the spread of Iran's Islamic Revolution, invaded, hoping to seize oil-rich borderlands. What he expected to be a quick victory turned into an 8-year nightmare. Both sides unleashed massive armies, but the front lines barely moved. It became a modern trench war, with barbed wire, human wave assaults, and even chemical weapons used openly by Iraq. Cities were bombed, oil tankers attacked in the Persian Gulf, and entire generations of young men were sent to die in mud-soaked battlefields. Neither side could gain the upper hand. By 1988, after staggering losses, both countries accepted a UN ceasefire. The result? A stalemate. Borders stayed the same, but the human cost was catastrophic. Around 1 million dead and millions more wounded or displaced. The war left Iraq deeply in debt, setting the stage for Saddam's invasion of Kuwait just 2 years later, and the Gulf War that would follow. The Soviet-Afghan War. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan to prop up its communist government against growing rebellion. What they expected to be a quick operation turned into a grinding, decade-long war. The Soviets brought tanks, helicopters, and overwhelming firepower. But they were met by the Mujahideen Afghan guerrilla fighters who knew the mountains better than anyone. Armed with hit-and-run tactics, and later U.S.-supplied Stinger missiles that could shoot down Soviet helicopters, they slowly bled the Red Army dry. The war became a Cold War proxy. The U.S., Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia funneled weapons and money to the Mujahideen, while the Soviets poured resources into a war they could not win. Villages were bombed, millions fled as refugees, and Afghanistan became a shattered battlefield. By 1989, the Soviets withdrew in defeat. The cost? About 1 million Afghans killed, plus 15,000 Soviet soldiers. The war drained Moscow's strength and morale, and many see it as a key factor in the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union itself. The Gulf War. In August 1980, Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein shocked the world by invading Kuwait, claiming it was stealing Iraqi oil. Within days, his army occupied the small, oil-rich nation, and suddenly Saddam controlled a huge share of the world's energy supply. The international response was swift. A U.S.-led coalition of over 30 countries gathered under the banner of the United Nations, demanding Iraq's withdrawal. When Saddam refused, Operation Desert Storm began in January 1991. What followed was one of the most one-sided wars in modern history. Coalition forces unleashed a massive air campaign, pounding Iraqi defenses and infrastructure for weeks. Then, in a ground assault lasting just 100 hours, they drove Saddam's army out of Kuwait. The war showed the world the power of modern, high-tech warfare. Precision bombs, stealth aircraft, and live news coverage broadcast the conflict into living rooms worldwide. Though Kuwait was liberated, Saddam remained in power, brutally crushing uprisings at home. The cost? Around 25,000, 50,000 Iraqis killed, compared to just 300 coalition deaths. The Gulf War reshaped Middle Eastern politics and set the stage for the U.S. invasion of Iraq a decade later. The Yugoslav Wars. In the 1990s, the breakup of Yugoslavia unleashed a series of brutal conflicts across the Balkans. As the communist state collapsed, ethnic and nationalist tensions exploded. It began in 1991 when Slovenia and Croatia declared independence, sparking clashes with the Yugoslav army. But the worst violence came in Bosnia, where Serbs, Croats, and Bosniaks all fought for control. The world watched in horror as cities were shelled and ethnic cleansing campaigns killed tens of thousands. The war reached its darkest moment at Srebrenica in 1995, where Bosnian Serb forces massacred more than 8,000 Muslim men and boys, Europe's worst atrocity since World War II. NATO eventually intervened with airstrikes, forcing peace talks. But conflict continued in Kosovo until 1999, when NATO again stepped in to stop Serbian forces from driving out ethnic Albanians. By the time the wars ended in 2001, over 140,000 people were dead, millions displaced, and Yugoslavia was no more and broken into the independent nations we see today. The Yugoslav Wars left scars of division and trauma that still shape the Balkans, a reminder of how quickly nationalism can turn deadly. The Second Congo War. Often called Africa's World War, the Second Congo War erupted in 1998 after the fall of dictator Mobutu and the rise of Laurent Kabila in the Democratic Republic of Congo. What began as a rebellion against Kabila quickly spiraled out of control. Soon, 9 African nations and over 25 armed groups were drawn into the conflict, with Rwanda, Uganda, and Burundi backing rebels, while Angola, Namibia, and Zimbabwe supported the Congolese government. The war devastated civilians. Villages were raided, child soldiers forced into battle, and systematic campaigns of rape and terror became weapons of war. Disease and starvation swept across the region as infrastructure collapsed. By the time peace deals were signed in 2003, the death toll had reached an almost unimaginable scale. Around 5 million people dead, the deadliest conflict since World War II. Even after the official war ended, violence never fully stopped. Armed groups continued fighting in eastern Congo, and the legacy of the conflict still fuels instability today. The Second Congo War remains one of history's most overlooked tragedies, a world war fought in Africa, largely forgotten by the rest of the globe. The War in Afghanistan. The war in Afghanistan began in October 2001 after the September 11th attacks on the United States. The U.S. and its allies invaded, targeting the Taliban, who had been sheltering al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden. At first, the Taliban were quickly overthrown, and hopes for a new, democratic Afghanistan emerged. But the victory was short-lived. The Taliban regrouped in rural areas and across the border in Pakistan, launching a long insurgency that dragged on year after year. The war became the longest in American history. Trillions of dollars were spent, and over time, more than 3,500 coalition soldiers and tens of thousands of Afghan civilians were killed. The conflict devastated Afghanistan, leaving millions displaced and the country deeply unstable. In 2011, bin Laden was killed in Pakistan, but the war raged on. Finally, in 2021, after 20 years of fighting, U.S. forces withdrew. Within weeks, the Taliban swept back into power, undoing 2 decades of efforts in a matter of days. The war's legacy is one of 20 years of sacrifice, billions spent, and an uncertain future for Afghanistan, a sobering reminder of the limits of modern military power. The Iraq War. In 2003, the United States and its allies launched a full-scale invasion of Iraq. The justification? Claims that dictator Saddam Hussein was hiding weapons of mass destruction and had ties to terrorism. Those weapons were never found. The invasion toppled Saddam in just weeks. Crowds cheered as his statue fell in Baghdad, but victory quickly unraveled. With no clear plan for rebuilding Iraq, the country descended into chaos. Sectarian violence exploded between Sunni and Shia groups, while extremist organizations like al-Qaeda in Iraq, and later ISIS, rose from the instability. Cities were bombed, militias battled in the streets, and U.S. forces found themselves trapped in a deadly insurgency. By the time American troops withdrew in 2011, more than 40,500 U.S. soldiers and at least 200,000 Iraqis were dead. The war left Iraq shattered, fueling years of instability and violence that still haunt the region today. The Iraq War became one of the most controversial conflicts of the modern era, a war fought on shaky evidence with consequences that reshaped the Middle East.